The history of our Earth is so different from what we can imagine.
Enjoy the journey.
The Smithsonian, that if they found out about a large skeleton somewhere, was to go get it.
I'm going to assume at least one person is right, because if one person's right, it busts the paradigm.
It all goes back to the fallen cherub. And the problem with the modern day church, they have a very truncated view of the supernatural.
This backdrop that's just pregnant with all kinds of meaning associated with this Mount Hermon event.
Welcome to Blurry Creatures.
And this guy defects from the kingdom. That's a big deal.
All right, welcome back to Blurry Creatures. We're at it again, Luke. We don't stop.
Yeah, we keep on pumping.
Yeah. We're navigating this wild world. We're getting ourselves into trouble. It's weird when you put yourself out on the internet because people start taking ownership of your show.
Who's taking ownership of our show?
People listening, man. We're riling people up, man. Whether it's like we post a photo of like a cave opening that they debate is real or not, or we don't have the right guests on the show, or you know what I mean? It's funny. Like you never know who's listening, and you never know how personal they take our actions. It's an interesting thing.
Yes, right. Wrong show, wrong hosts, wrong guests.
Yeah,
everything wrong.
I will say, Luke, this hits a nerve for me because as a ex-band dude, there's nothing more frustrating than entitled fans. They felt like they owned you. You had to do everything they said. If you weren't on or you weren't around to talk, there was just this ownership that I own you. I own your art. You know, there's people out there that want our show to be what they want it to be, not what we want it to be. It's our show. We're going to do whatever we want to do. If you don't like it, start your own show. I just dealt with it a lot as a band guy. So it just strikes a little bit of a chord when some of these reviews come in because I know what a 1-star podcast is. It's zero effort. It's no thought. It's bad guests. It's terrible audio quality. That's a 1-star podcast. And these people will give you reviews because they don't like the opinions. And that's what 2020 to me is funny, is that people go onto a podcast and expect the echo chamber of whatever they think and feel. And you tell them something different. They give you a 1-star because you didn't say what they wanted you to say. Because this entitlement. And that's how I feel. And I'm ranting a little bit because it's my podcast. And I can do that.
Right. And then there's just a lot of Monday morning quarterbacks, right? Everybody thinks that they can do it better.
Unless you've put yourself out there creatively, you just don't understand. Like, most people doing creative stuff, it's all pro bono. Always.
You're fired up, dude.
I know.
That's fine. This is the world we live in, man. We aren't for everybody. You can't make everybody happy. And by the way, all we're doing is asking questions. I mean, that's the crazy thing, right? I mean, we put stuff out there and people are just saying, I mean, half the time it's like, what do you think of this? What do you think of that?
Right?
You know, we just live in a space in a time where critical thinking is at a premium because people don't do it. They don't read. They only read headlines, and everything is meant to be incendiary, and everybody's offended.
Yeah,
we want to encourage people to critically think. There's more data and more connectivity than ever before, which means that you don't have to trust what mainstream sources tell you. You can actually spend the time, if you want to, searching out people who have put in the 10,000 hours to be experts, that maybe don't have, don't curry the favor, of mainstream academia or mainstream media. And I encourage people to do that because you have all these things at your fingertip. This is a phenomena that really, is maybe 30 years old. Before this, you had to go to the library and pull out a card catalog and look for books, and you had to kind of trust that whatever source, would turn the news on, that Tom Brokaw was telling you the truth. And now we have, the ability to get outside that. A lot of people in control and power don't like that. But all we're doing is asking questions, Nate. Like, I mean, we can post things that people send us and say, what do you think of this? What does this look like? People just like being mad online. This is a big joke I had with some of my friends. It's just people love and live to be mad online. So glad to have you people mad online.
This kind of gets into the subjects to kind of poke at people is just conspiracy theories. And I thought it would be rad to have Doug Van Dorn back on the show, talk about conspiracy theories. He wrote a book called Conspiracy Theory. And one thing we get into, Luke, all the time is, where are the bones? Why is academia not talking about it? Right. Why is there even a subject called alternative history? And there's half the population has been trained, I think, to knee-jerk at the word conspiracy theory, and then they don't have to, they conveniently don't have to look into any of the information ever, right?
Well, we also know that was coined strategically. That term conspiracy theory was coined strategically, by the CIA for use in propaganda. It's a way to shut people down that have different ideas, right? Or that possibly are onto something outside the preferred narrative. So the fact that it even has negative connotations just means that we're all buying into the programming or have bought into the programming at some level. We find things out all the time. This is the history of humankind, is believing things and then finding out that those aren't correct. Whether it be, Galileo, or we talk about the Book of Enoch a lot on this show. And for the longest time, it was not it was, people thought that the Book of Enoch pulled from Peter and from Jude, and it would lift it directly out of that. And we're finding out now, because of the Dead Sea Scrolls, because we found history, because archaeology exists, that it actually predates all of that. It's amazing. We live in a time where people say trust the science, but the science is always, the idea of science is to ask questions, and it's always changing, right? This is the hypocrisy and ludicrousy in trusting the science. I think it goes hand in hand with this whole thing of conspiracy theorists, because it's just a way to brush off and disregard things that you don't find that jive with the common narrative or your preferred narrative. There's a lot of things, I think, that are out there that people like to disregard and brush off that have a lot of validity. And I think most of it is because it makes people in power uncomfortable. And it causes you to open your mind. We talked about, opening your mind with a ton of guests. I think most recently probably Dr. Michael Heiser, about having an open mind when it comes to the Bible and biblical things and Genesis 6, and living in the first 12 chapters, 15 chapters of Genesis, and understanding the things that you got to open your mind to. And I think that's a microcosm. We talk about the church. Open your mind to context, to history, to things not being necessarily the way that we're told they'd be or the way they're supposed to be. I use that in quotations.
Well, I think you and I are in a unique place where we're kind of halfway through our life. And we're not young 20-year-olds who know everything. And
we look good, though.
But you know what I'm saying, though? Like, Nate 6-7 years ago, vastly different than Nate now. I'm in a place where I've had some ebbs and flows. I've had some valleys. I've had some peaks. And a lot of people listening to this show, depending on where you are in your life, you can't open your mind, right? And it just reminds me of that quote, from Yoda, Luke.
Oh, we're going to quote Yoda. All right.
You must unlearn what you have learned.
Remember when he's talking to Luke?
Yeah.
So some people just can't where they are in their life, right? They know everything. And you and I grew up in the church. I mean, dude, I was in church service 6 days a week because I went to Christian school. Yeah. So I heard the Bible stories every day, all day, and then went to church on Sunday. Saturday was my only day off. I was involved in Young Life. I worked at a Christian summer camp. I've been around hundreds of groups of Christians. Dude, I never heard anything about the Giants. It never came up.
Well, Goliath comes up, but it's always David and Goliath. Like, he was just this, he was a giant.
Yeah.
How often do you dig into things in the Old Testament? I mean, we've all heard the stories. You think about Exodus and think, oh yeah, Moses, led the people out. But there's so much more there if you dig into it. But I think we're so used to the stories that maybe we don't spend time actually reading the words. And I think I was thinking about that today, actually. I was listening to the Naked Bible podcast, and Heiser's breaking down Revelation, and you start realizing, dude, I didn't know any of this stuff.
Oh yeah,
and some of the Septuagint and the Hebrew. There's something to be said for reading the words, and I went back to what I just said before. Is I think we live in a 15-second attention span where people read headlines, don't read into any articles or any of the meat and potatoes of a lot of things. And I think we're a dumber society for it.
Yeah. But even some people gave pushback on Heiser who listened to our show.
Of
they
course.
wanted him to get a little weirder, right?
Well, then there's also, like, anytime you tread in theology, you step on anybody's toes because everybody believes they have the right interpretation of the scriptures. Or just in a broader term, there's a lot of people in camps think they have the right interpretation of facts, which is a bizarre thing to think. But
well, the cool thing about a podcast is we're able to, because we're not a part of an institution and we're not a part of academia. At the end of the day, like, for instance, say you're a doctor, Luke, and you figure out something that goes against the medical establishment, right? You can't come out and say anything, right? Because if you do, guess what? You can lose your credentials, and then you're not a doctor anymore, right?
Which is crazy, because, like, this is, man, I'm supposed to live in the land of the free here. We're becoming a place where if you have a different opinion, and we're talking about opinions, because, again, science, the people say trust, there's no science in your terms. Like, science is asking questions. It's supposed to be an empirical process of finding the answers, and it changes all the time. Remember, doctors were promoting smoking in the 50s.
Sure.
And look where we are now, right?
Yeah.
So it's fall in line, eat the bugs, live in your pod.
Right.
Don't create any waves.
Well, I think Heiser's a part of academia, right? So he's got a lot of friends who are his peers, right? There's a lot of pressure on him to be extremely data-driven. And if a 20-foot skeleton falls into that, it's hard for, they're a part of a system, they're a part of a group, and it's really hard to open your mind. We were talking about that just a second ago. It's like, well, you can't open it so far that your brains fall out, but at the same time, you have to be aware of the fact that you're a part of systems that can keep you from opening your mind.
Right, and even us, Nate. I mean, we have, like, for sure we have blind spots, right? I think part of the process here too is trying to uncover those
for sure
to see what we don't see, right? And that's I'm not saying up here that you and I have the truth. I just think we like to present a platform for these people who spent the time, who spent the 10,000 hours, and are experts to weigh in on topics in maybe ways people haven't heard, and weigh in on fringe topics that people would prefer stayed in the box.
I guess my question to people out there listening is, what's something that in your adult life, what's something you completely changed your mind on, a 180? To me, it was how I was reading the Bible. I'm talking 38 years old, 7 or 8 years pot committed to a very modern read of the Bible, flip the switch. And like Richard Sorensen was saying in the last episode, Luke, like, scientists aren't going to do that. If they find something that throws a wrench in what they've been pushing down the track for 200 years, they're not going to abandon their whole livelihood to say, oh yeah, these giants existed. We have their fossil record. And that throws a complete wrench into our Darwinism narrative, right?
Oh, well, it exposes a house of cards, right?
A house of cards indeed. Just like the government narrative, right? Which brings us to our topic today, conspiracy theories. Are there institutions out there that are creating narratives for us to believe in? And are there small guys outside of the system rallying against that and bringing you the truth? And that truth is being branded as a conspiracy. We bring on Doug Van Dorn. He was on the show before, but he comes back on to talk about conspiracies. He wrote a book about giants, but he also wrote a book about conspiracies. So it falls right into our wheelhouse. We appreciate you guys. Thanks for listening, sharing this with friends, and letting us rant a little bit. We're 37 episodes into this podcast, so we're starting to get a little bit more into our thoughts and feelings about all this stuff. So with that, let's welcome Doug. So welcome back to the show, Doug Van Dorn. Doug, I've been following you on Facebook. We were just talking about you getting deleted from Facebook several times for speaking your mind, which, seems to be like the case for a lot of people these days. They go online, they say what they want, and they get deleted. And then some of my friends are like, it's not happening. Big tech censorship's not happening. But you wrote a book called Conspiracy Theory, A Christian Evaluation of a Taboo Subject. And something that we always tackle on our show is people talking about the bones disappearing, the Smithsonian showing up, all these narratives that have been labeled conspiracy theories. You know, even our last guest that was on this last week was saying we have to be careful that we don't entertain conspiracy theories. And I'm at the point where I'm like, I don't care. Like, what does that even mean anymore, right? So it felt good to bring you on and try to unpack, like, why are people so afraid of the word? And obviously 2020 opened up a lot of people's minds to maybe all these conspiracy theories aren't theories, right?
Maybe not all of them.
But which ones? You know, how do you navigate that? So welcome back to the show. It's good to have you again. Maybe we can dive into like why your Facebook accounts were deleted. What were you saying to get deleted, and why do you think they deleted you?
Boy, so that was back in August, and that's right about when the big time censorship really hit, the first wave of it, and then there was another one right before the election. I'm not entirely sure what the trigger was, although I have my speculation. So I had created a meme, which was a bunch of explosions happening. I don't know if you remember that explosion in Lebanon.
Oh yeah,
last summer.
Yeah,
it was just crazy.
Was it
right?
like a plant that was making hydrochloroquine? Something like that, right? No,
I don't remember.
I think
actually.
it was. I think it was like
there were so many of them. So what I did was I put together a meme, and it just kept growing and growing and growing of all these explosions. And there was talk in the Q movement of a hot summer. And so I just made this meme, kind of being goofy about it, and it like exploded. I was totally shocked. And USA Today actually did a fact check on me and said it was untrue.
No.
And the reason
way.
why it was untrue is because I had put up there that these had all happened in the last 24 hours. And they said, no, one of them happened the day before that. And so that allowed them to be able to censor the meme. I mean, it's just a picture of a bunch of explosions. That's all it was.
I love that you say that the meme exploded itself.
It totally did.
About exploding. Yeah, so it does take off. I mean, there was an explosion here in Nashville, where we're from.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, that's a crazy thing that happened there.
Yeah, you've seen that video. The video is wild, too, because it looks like the explosion's across the street from the RV. I mean, they see all the security footage, and then never has the FBI wrapped up a case so easily and so quickly.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
So last night on Facebook, I decided to make a post, and it was based on a conversation I had with a girl I went to college with on Facebook. And she was really angry at Tucker Carlson. So she's a pretty liberal person. She said that she's mad because this conservative liberal divide, and she tried to make this thing that a lot of people don't believe is actually happening, the censorship, be about conservatives versus liberals. So I decided to make a little post, and it said, if you think that that's what's going on, you got another thing coming. Because she posted that she sees all kinds of conservative comments running across her feed. That's not the problem. They're not censoring you because you're conservative. They're censoring you because you're talking about things that happened in 2020, 2021. If you talk about hydroxychloroquine, or if you talk about the vaccine, not any vaccines, like you can be anti-vax and not get taken off of these platforms. But if you talk about the vaccine for COVID, you'll get removed immediately. Talk about the election fraud or January 6th or anything like this. You cannot speak about these things. I mean, there have been hundreds of thousands of people that have been deplatformed. I've literally seen just waves and waves of these on Telegram, because everybody's had to move over to different platforms that will allow them to be able to say what they want to say.
Yeah.
So it's real. And but it's just not where a lot of people think that it is. It's a lot more complex than just the media hating Republicans or something like that.
So then, I mean, this is good. Like, I'm looking at your book here, and you've got Bigfoot, not unironically, considering our show in the far end of the artwork. So
how old are you guys?
Nate's 40. I'm 39.
Okay, so did you ever watch $6 Million Man?
Yes.
Yeah. All right. So there's an episode in that show with Bigfoot,
Andre,
and they go through this tunnel that goes around in circles. And I was scared to death of this Bigfoot. I mean, I used to have nightmares of this guy over and over and over and over. And turns out that it was actually Andre the Giant playing Bigfoot in that show.
Oh yeah.
And so I told my brother who designed the cover for this book, I'm like, here's what I want, and I want you to put Bigfoot from the $6 Million Man thing on there, and then do whatever you want. So that's
look at Andre. I love it.
That's awesome, because we're always tracing down if Bigfoot's related to the giants on our show, and boom, here we are. Can't get away from it.
There you
go. And you also wrote a book about giants for those listening who haven't listened to our first episode with you. We're not just getting political today. There's a lot of threads here about the giants, about modern day people getting canceled off social media and deplatformed. And so I think it all makes sense. Hopefully people can follow the logic there. What were you going to say, Luke? Were you going to ask a question? I kind of just dived in.
No, I just wanted to dive into the conspiracy theory aspect. I'm fascinated on Doug's opinion on that and the whole subject, because we do kind of fall into a lot of that in some people's opinions, right?
Right.
And I know that Nate, being the curator of all things content when it comes to Blurry Creatures, he gets a fair amount of pushback from people saying this is a conspiracy theory, that's a conspiracy theory,
pseudoscience.
Pseudoscience. I mean, you name it, right? Like, yeah, I'm ready for you to drop some knowledge on us on this topic.
Funny to talk about pseudoscience when we've got people wearing masks outside in trails by themselves, and these are the people that are talking about pseudoscience.
Yeah,
so.
right.
Whatever.
Yeah.
I know. Where do we even begin, right? Like, this is a hard episode to start on. So maybe we can start here. Like, how do you even navigate this if you're just somebody who's never looked into anything taboo? Are there like some tips that you give people? Like,
well, I guess I could tell you my story. That's kind of how I begin the book.
Okay.
How I got interested in the topic. I mean, I've always been interested in weird things. In Search Of, you remember that show with Leonard Nimoy?
Oh yeah.
And of course X-Files and stuff like that. So you can see how old I am by all these shows I'm dropping. But I remember my first baby was I think 9 days old when 9/11 happened, and I remember taking this little infant in my arms and watching. I watched the second building fall live. I didn't watch the first one fall live, and I remember thinking in my head, that looks like a controlled demolition. That was my first thought. Okay. So back when I was, I don't know, probably 12 or something, my dad worked downtown Denver at the 40th story of the biggest building down there on a corner. And they were going to demo this old hotel called the Cosmopolitan Hotel down in Denver. And so he took us to see it. And so that's a very memorable thing when you watch, a 10-story building being controlled demo right in front of your eyes. And I think that was the image that went into my mind. I'd always wonder what would happen if these buildings fell down, and wouldn't they just fall over sideways or something, And then all of a sudden they fall down. So then immediately the narrative was that, these planes hit the building and the steel melted because of the jet fuel, and that was that. And then George Bush came out and said, we're not going to talk about conspiracy theories. And, that was that. And I never entertained another thought about it for many, many years. Started talking to a friend probably 10 years later about 9/11 and how happy I was at George Bush. And he's like, you're kidding me, right? Well, what are you talking about? He goes, dude, they totally took that whole thing down. It was a setup. So this guy was obviously into conspiracy theory.
Yeah.
And I had never even entertained that thought since that initial moment. And it was just kind of like a seed that was planted in my mind. So then, I start working on this giant book, probably right about the same time. I mean, that book came out in 2013 and took me several years to write it. And I remember in that whole research of the Nephilim coming across this, conspiracy theory that the Smithsonian got a hold of all these giant bones from the Americas. I mean, these giant, they made a TV show about it on the History Channel. You should put that in quotes, right? But so they made a lot of money off this. I mean, there's giant bones all over the country, and it's like, well, where are the bones? Well, the Smithsonian got a hold of them, and they put them in their basement, or they dropped them out at sea, or whatever the case. And so it's like I just kept coming back to this whole idea of conspiracy theories. So I started just kind of to get interested in the topic more generally, and I had been wanting to write a book on conspiracy theories just from a Christian point of view, just trying to think through it rationally, as much as you can, and to try and give both sides if I could, instead of just one side. Like you go on evangelical websites, the big guys, and it is nothing but attacking conspiracy theories. That's all it is. There is no other side that can be told. So I kind of wanted to see if I could write a book that would be a little bit more fair. And that's really what the point of the book is. So that's kind of my story. And, it was just kind of like, I needed something in my mind to be able to get me to entertain the idea of conspiracy theories, to think through it logically. And then, I put this book out last April because of 2020. I mean, as soon as the whole mask thing hit initially, my mind was like, there is something seriously wrong here. We had a guy that was in our church it was on a Zoom meeting. This was back, I think, in March of last year. And for some reason, Jeb Bush was on the phone call. And Jeb Bush said, guys, you need to get ready because we have entered the age of the pandemic. So he told the whole group of people on this Zoom call.
Wow.
Like, you got to be kidding me. This is back in March. What? How could you possibly know that? This is just a freak accident of nature, right? So this book came out of me like really, really quickly. And I hadn't been able to write it for the whole 5 years I've been thinking about it before. I just kept getting blocked. So
it's funny how inspiration happens. I was so many musicians and other people, like they just have that moment. They have that spark, and it sounds like 2020 sparked it for you. I have a similar story. We don't get too into that on this show, but I was at a friend showed me like several videos of Building 7 collapsing in 9/11, and it's really weird because it's off in the corner, far away from the planes, and it just falls. And it's like, you see stuff like that, and you're like, dude, something's not right. And then, you go back and you start looking into JFK, and George Bush Sr. is connected to that whole thing, and it goes all the way up. So, it gets really weird. But even Judd was talking about how George Washington was supposedly dealing with the Illuminati back when he first came into office.
And he also was a very high-ranking Mason. So you wonder, was he dealing with it or was he working with the Illuminati, right?
Question.
Which side is he on?
It's wild. So Doug, for you then, like when you're looking at what are some of the big conspiracy theories? I know you touched on 9/11, and then we're obviously talking about what's going on right now. I know you write it from the standpoint of like, here's how careful Christians should be aware of these things and how we should integrate the idea of this pushback. And you just talked about it. On these evangelical websites, you've got people just attacking other people for having different thoughts or seeing things in a different way. What do you think are the biggest threats right now to the narrative? Like if you were to look at and say some of these conspiracy theories these are the ones. What do you think has the biggest pushback, and why do you think that is?
So fairly late in the book, I start thinking about logical ways to think about a conspiracy theory, like any individual theory, and like what should go in your mind if you're entertaining the idea. And I talk about things like, is it coherent? Is it internally consistent with itself? Is there any kind of correspondence with reality that you can find with it? Or is it just something just completely made up? Is there any kind of falsifiability that you can have with whatever the theory is? Or is it, in other words, can you bring it into the realm of science at all? Is it just a completely circular kind of an argument? So those are the kind of things that just kind of basic philosophy tests. And I'm not saying that you can apply them all to every conspiracy theory and come to an answer of whether or not the thing is true. But your question about the reason I went there, okay, to answer your question is because I've been looking at 2020, 2021 now since the very first moment that they started masking us and telling us we had 10 days to flatten the curve, thinking something's wrong. And it's like there was no coherence to this narrative that they're feeding me. Like it's disparate. It's scattered. It's like it's contradictory with itself. So in so many places. So I honestly went looking to see if there were people that had other answers. And I'm telling you, I think that the conspiracy theories that are being labeled that by whether it's evangelicals or Newsmax or CNN or whatever the case might be, these things have a lot more explanatory power to help people understand what's happening than what the main narrative is. And so those are things that I mentioned at the very beginning. Like, is there some sort of a plot behind this virus? Was it just completely natural? Was Wuhan involved with it? I mean, our president said that it was. And are there any of the main players that are involved in the Wuhan lab? Like, I don't know, Fauci having, conflict of interest with that very laboratory, those kinds of things. Like, you never hear about that, but you don't have to go long to dig to find that there's real problems that are going on. And so it's like, I think that the things that we're not being allowed to talk about and that people are being deplatformed for, that people are losing their incomes for, are hovering over that target.
Yeah. Mostly they say a lot, right? They say that a lot. Like when the heat turns up real hot, it means you're right over the target.
Well,
that's right.
Well, they're not deplatforming you because they're trying to protect the masses. That's for sure.
Well, they're deplatforming people because they're involved with what's going on.
Well, I'm saying, I tell that to a friend. I was like, they're protecting themselves, not you.
Yeah, that's right.
Right?
That's exactly right.
And people think, oh, no, they're protecting us. They're keeping us from propaganda. I'm like, no. They're protecting themselves. Since when has a corporation ever been interested in you? Ever, right?
Except for your money.
So I found an academic book on conspiracy theories that I read. And one of the things that the author pointed out was that, first of all, the whole American experiment since the very beginning has been involved with conspiracy theories. Like it's part and parcel of who we are, going back all the way to the revolution. Okay. And the narrative that we spun about England and what they were spinning back towards us. And I thought it was really, really interesting because she said at one point, have to go look for the quote, but basically she said that a thinking man was always involved with conspiratorial thoughts, always, because that meant that you're willing to entertain different ideas. You weren't stuck in one place.
It's critical thinking.
And so something happened between then and today that caused the term conspiracy or conspiracy theory to basically switch 180 degrees from the way that people had thought about it before that. And you guys have probably heard the conspiracy theory that the CIA was behind that.
Yeah.
Yes.
Right. So there's actually some truth to that. So, you brought up JFK earlier as one of the big conspiracy theories that people have. So there was a commission called the Warren Commission that they had right immediately after he was assassinated to investigate his murder. Right. And they came out with something called concerning criticism. That was to deal with speculation about the responsibility of his murder. So they're writing material about how to help people think about speculating about his murder. And This is what they say, quote, "The aim of this dispatch is to provide material countering and discrediting the claims of the conspiracy theorists," end quote. And that's we have that actually. I put that document at the end in an appendix in the book. So they actually took the phrase, like some people say, one of the conspiracy theories is that they invented the phrase conspiracy theory. They didn't invent it. It's been around since the 1880s is what I could find on Google Books. It was never used in a bad way. It wasn't, it was just kind of a neutral term being used actually in courts of law. But the CIA and the Warren Commission actually took that phrase and they spun it so that conspiracy theory as a term now is a negative thing only. You cannot deal with conspiracy theories and in any positive way.
Yeah. I remember George Bush saying that. We should not entertain conspiracy theories. And it's like, oh man, that guy's got it on his head. He's feeling guilty. Well, it says in Ecclesiastes, there's a verse, Ecclesiastes 8:11 says, "Do not call conspiracy everything these people regard as conspiracy. Do not fear what they fear. Do not live in dread. The Lord of hosts is the one you shall regard as holy." There was talk of conspiracy theories even in the Bible. Are there, besides, the fact that the government told everyone that the disciples came and stole the body, which is a government narrative, like, are there some original conspiracy theories that you can point to in the Bible that can say that this has been going on since the dawn of time? Like, do we see that continually happening, that these narratives just get spun and the masses believe it?
Absolutely. So that verse you brought up, I bring it up in the book.
Oh, awesome.
Because a lot of people will talk about that verse and say, see, we're not supposed to entertain conspiracy theories.
Yeah.
But what's so funny about that, it's like completely ironic, because the whole point there is that they were spinning conspiracy theories about God's prophets, saying they're not really God's prophets.
Disinformation even back then, right?
So like the whole thing is like, you couldn't take something more out of context than what people do to make that verse say that Christians should never think about conspiracy theories. So you can go back to the Garden of Eden for the first conspiracy theory, which is the serpent, the Nahash, talking to Eve, and she's conspiring to deceive our first parents. And of course, we buy that lie. God had told them what the truth was. He slightly twists it, and we're cast out of the garden because of it.
That's a good point. I mean, he spun the original conspiracy theory that God doesn't want you to know all these things, and but you should. Like, God doesn't want, the reason you can't eat from that tree is he doesn't want you to know all that. I mean, conspiracy theories go back to the very beginning.
To the very, very beginning.
They're always projecting the thing that they're guilty of.
That's exactly right.
I mean, I think my heart goes out to people who are just asleep to that. I don't care. I mean, there's no way that the average person is going to stop these nefarious people from following through with their plans. But when you see your friends asleep to some of these narratives,
it's tough.
They think we're the crazy ones.
Yeah.
Doug, I want to just tie this into what we've been talking about. Like, why you've written about the giants and the watchers and the things that happen in Genesis 6. Why do you think there's such a pushback and a labeling of that narrative along with the book of Enoch as a conspiracy theory when it comes to the church? Because we see this. Like we see this a lot, actually. Like we've joined a couple groups, Nate and I, and so I see these things come through, especially on Facebook and in these discussion rooms about how, I saw one today about how they said, well, the sons of God weren't actually angels. That's completely a conspiracy theory. That's not what it's referring to. And if you believe that, you're a conspiracy theorist. And then that's where they start with you. And then there's this pushback. I mean, either there's a passive one where we just don't address this in the church, or there's a very real pushback to, man, when you start talking about anything like that, that's a conspiracy theory. That doesn't fit within our dogma or within our denomination or our belief or interpretation of the scriptures. Why do you think that's such a sticking point? Because it seems to be, the more that this podcast to me has opened my eyes in a lot of ways to seeing, just how little is addressed in a lot of ways that doesn't fit neatly in a box when it comes to the biblical narrative. But that one especially, all I have to do is open a discussion board somewhere on that talks about it, and you can see that people are very passionately saying, if you believe in that, or believe that you believe in the account in Enoch and all the stuff, then you're a conspiracy, basically a biblical conspiracy theorist.
So the truth is actually exactly the opposite of that. Again, I mean, I'm being serious, and I've studied this. I've read PhD dissertations on this topic, peer-reviewed journal articles that deal with the history of this exact subject. So I know what I'm talking about in this particular thing. I don't know a lot about a lot of things, but I guess for good or bad, I know about this subject. So Genesis 6, when you go back to the oldest literature that we have, and you can do it with the Jews and you can do it with Christians, both. So you can go back, and I think we have over a dozen different Jewish pseudepigrapha, which include Enoch, but there's a lot more that talk about Genesis 6. And without exception, 100% of them have the supernatural sons of God, heavenly being view. 100% of them. That's true all the way until the 2nd century AD, at which point the rabbis changed some things. And we can talk about why that is. It's actually probably, to me, it's the most important part of the book and thinking about this in the biblical idea of conspiracy theories, because it gets to Christ, the Son of God. So in the church, the same thing. Without exception, 100% of the people that talk about this subject, we have like 20 different sources, all take the supernatural angelic view. And I argue very strongly that Jude and Peter and Jesus are all included in that. Okay. That doesn't change until somewhere in the late, I think 4th century with Ephraim the Syrian, So there's actually a guy who did a study on this. You can go to academia online and read his paper about the provenance, the origin of the Sethite view. And he thinks it's coming out of Syria for whatever reason. And then that ends up spreading over the course of the next 30, 40 years to Chrysostom and Augustine and Theodoret, who all take this Sethite view and they run with it. And because they're so powerful and such huge figures in the church, that just becomes kind of cemented. And it's like everybody forgot the older view. And what's so really interesting about that is, and we find the same thing in the Reformation with Calvin and Luther both on this topic, is that without exception, they all say, I couldn't believe the supernatural view was true, so I don't. And then they just make fun of anybody who believes in it. That's their argument. It's really crazy. Like, so they changed the entire history of the interpretation of this that we know of, based on the crazy mad fools of the Jewish belief. And I couldn't believe that it was true. And I couldn't believe that it was true. And I couldn't believe that it was true.
I think my thought is, I mean, Doug, you were saying earlier in the show that you saw a controlled demolition of a building, and then when you saw 9/11 happen, you kind of triggered a connection there.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of people, they don't have any practical supernatural things happening in their life. So when they read the Bible, they can't connect the dots. They can't go, oh, I saw an angel come down and speak to my friend, so therefore I can read that part of the story. We live in this matrix where nothing is supernatural. We go to Walmart, we come home, nothing supernatural ever happens. So we read this book and we can't connect the dots. So what do you think has to happen in your mind and your heart to even read that part of the story? Because it took a long time for me to read it. What happens in people? How do you connect the dots there?
Great question, Nate. So I think there's another part here. So there's not just the changing of the text that was really done by the rabbis. So don't forget to remind me to go back to that, because I really want to talk about that. But
yeah. Sorry.
But there's something else that I think needs to happen. People need to understand that they have been more influenced by secularism, by naturalism, by rationalism, by evolution than they ever want to admit. Like if you go back prior to those kind of movements of the 1800s, especially, and you read like Puritan hymns and stuff, you see supernatural stuff all over the place. And it's like all of a sudden it just vanishes from the church, at least in the West. And so it's like we're fighting the entire culture, but we pride ourselves on the fact that we're conservative evangelicals who believe in the Trinity, and I believe in angels, and I believe in Satan. And so it's like we have this, I guess pride is probably the best word for it, that we know that we believe in the supernatural. But when it comes down to nitty gritty, like Genesis 6, which is just staring us in the face, and if you understand the worldview and you're willing to entertain the thought, all of a sudden, I mean, the entire Bible opens up in ways that you had never been able to see before. I remember telling people this worldview of the sons of God, in Genesis 6, and just taking them through passages just in Deuteronomy. And several people said to me at the same time, like, where have these verses been in my Bible my whole life? I've never read them before. Well, what happened was you needed eyes to see. So I think you need to recognize that maybe you're not as open to something as you like to think that you are. And then you need to be able to have somebody explain to you in a coherent, rational, historical, biblical way, a different alternative, so that at least your mind can be thinking about it, processing it. I mean, I don't say that you have to come to the same conclusion on Genesis 6 that I do, but if you come to the Sethite view, at least know your history and know that you're going against 400 years of church history if you're going to do that.
Yes, let's talk about that, because you said that it was the second century, and that's what I want to go back to now with the rabbis. Up until that point, there was, as you said before, there was this view, and there was this view on the text and on the context of Genesis 6 that was changed. And so what happened there? Because that's the point, right? Where we're saying this became sort of starts to tread into the conspiracy theory space, because we had a group of people decide that wasn't what it was.
Yeah. So this whole the whole desupernaturalization started with the rabbis, and I think that what happened is it made its way into the church, and the church didn't recognize it. They didn't know. It wasn't done maliciously. It was done really out of ignorance of the history. So in a lot of ways, I don't blame those guys. And like the Book of Enoch was just lost.
Or destruction of the temple, right? They it was gone.
A lot of things were messed up in 70 AD. That's for sure. So the very shortest answer I can give you is what happened was Jesus of Nazareth. That's what happened. So what's one of the titles that he's given in the New Testament? The Son of God. Okay, so the Son of God is a supernatural title that in that world, 100% of the people understood that, because they understood that the sons of God were angelic heavenly beings. They knew Psalm 82:1. Jesus talks about this with them. In John 10, he brings up, I said, you are gods, all of you. And people have so badly misunderstood what he's saying there. He's not calling the rabbis gods. He's not saying, hey guys, you're a god, I'm a god, we're all gods. What's the problem? What he's saying is, I'm one of those guys. That's what he's saying. I came down from heaven. I'm one of those sons of God. Oh, and by the way, I'm also one with the Father. He says that in the very same passage. And so what do? That doesn't appease them. They want to pick up, they want to pick up stones and kill him for blasphemy. So it's the title Son of God. I think that's really the connector there to sons of God. So like if you go to Deuteronomy 32, 7, 8, and 9, it talks about how there's this inheritance that God gave to the nations, and he numbered the nations. And he's talking about Tower Babel, the 70 nation, and said that God numbered them according to the sons of God, gave them their inheritance. So the worldview is that he's giving each of these nations at Babel that were split apart in the tongues and the division, he's setting a fallen spiritual being over them. But the next verse 9, Deuteronomy 32:9 says, but the Lord's portion is Israel. Jacob is his allotted inheritance. So who's the Lord there? Well, people just default to that's like just God, whatever that is, or the Father or something. It's not. It's the sons of God and the Son of God. The Son of God receives Israel as his inheritance in the same way that the sons of God receive the nations as their inheritance. So there's this whole thing going on in the background, all right? With Yahweh being the Son of God. And there's another Yahweh, the Father in heaven, but there's only one God. And this is what the New Testament is writing into. And the claim is, like, if we were to look at John 1, the first famous verse, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. Well, where's that idea of the Word coming from? Well, it's coming from somebody like Abraham, who sees the Word in a vision in Genesis 15:1. John's getting it from the Old Testament. And then later he starts saying that, and check this verse out. I don't know if you guys have ever read it this way or not, but this is like verses like 9, 10, 11. The true light, which gives light to everyone, was coming into the world. So he's talking about the coming of Jesus in the incarnate, in the flesh. But then he goes, he was in the world, and the world was made through him, but the world did not know him. Then it says he came to his own, and his own people did not receive him. What's that talking about? It's not talking about like the disciples in the days of his flesh. It's talking about the Israelites in the Old Testament.
Yeah.
To all who did receive him, who believed in his name. So there's one of the titles that the angel of the Lord is given in the Old Testament, is the name of God. He gave the right to become children of God. And then, so he uses this word glory, he uses the word, it uses the word name. And then he finally comes to the verse and says, but the Word became flesh and dwelt among us, and we've beheld his glory, the glory of the only Son from the Father, the only begotten Son from the Father. He's from the Father. He's eternal. So what happened was, that's your background that you need to understand, that the claim is that Jesus he's not just one of the heavenly sons of God, but he is the God of Israel. And the Pharisees were absolutely infuriated by this. So they found some very clever ways of sometimes just retranslating their text and sometimes reinterpreting it, like in Genesis 6, so that like the sons of God in Genesis 6, well, they're no longer supernatural beings. Those are just fallen, wicked human rulers. And presto, the problem is solved. You don't have to worry about the Son of God being a title for a heavenly being anymore because we've taken care of that. There's another one that I talk about, and this is a conspiracy theory since we're talking about it. The conspiracy theory is that Melchizedek is the angel of the Lord, okay? And I think that I would argue that Hebrews 7 is talking about this. He's eternal. He has no beginning, has no ending. There's a whole worldview that we find in the Dead Sea Scrolls that talk about Melchizedek being like this supernatural being. So this is really strange thing that happens in, of all places, Genesis 11, which is nothing but a genealogy. It's a genealogy that has a bunch of years attached to the names of the sons of Shem. And when you read the Hebrew, there are 650 years different than there are in the Greek Septuagint. And all they did was drop the number 100 out. And you want to know why they did it? It's because they found a way to say that Shem was Melchizedek. And all they had to do was drop out 650 years of time. And now Shem laps Melchizedek. And presto, Melchizedek's not a supernatural being. He's just a perfectly normal person. So there's several examples of this kind of a thing going on. It's conspiracy theory. They're literally tampering with the text or with the interpretation. And then they say, because they're the rabbis, they're the teachers, they say, this is the way it's going to be from now on. And anybody who entertains a supernatural idea of Genesis 6 is a heretic, and you will be cut off from the people of Israel.
And that just goes back to Jesus, is what we're saying, right? That the whole point of that
It goes back to Jesus. It's all about this, because, think about it. Jews are converting left and right to Christianity in the first 40 years until 70 AD. Now they lose their temple. They lose the center of their religion, and they're dispersed into the nations. So, this is a people and a religion that's in total crisis. And at the heart of the whole thing is this guy, Jesus. So we need to find a way to deal with this once for all so that our people will stop converting to Christianity. And boy, they've done such an effective job that it's very, very hard to talk to Jews even to this day, because they don't have the category that there could be a second supernatural person in the Old Testament that is also God.
Well,
but they have the categories in Jesus's day.
Part of me thinks like some of the problems I don't know if this makes sense, but I'm kind of thinking there's just for lack of better words to describe this, there's like a fourth dimensional history and then a 3-dimensional history. So we have like human history, and then we have this angelic history, right?
Yeah.
And people deny that the fourth dimension history exists and is interacting and causing lots of rifts in the third dimension, right? So you have these two things playing against each other. And I just think the ancient rabbis, like people like to, especially Christians, love to say, oh, you're being a Pharisee right now. What I think you're saying to me often is like, no, we're the Pharisee most of the time. Right? Yeah, we think, oh, you're being a Pharisee, when it's actually, no, I'm actually, it's like
you're
that
the one who brought up projection a little while ago.
Right? Exactly. It's like, it reminds me of that scene in, when he's dead the whole time, the psychologist, what's the movie called? Sixth Sense, right? So, so it's that he realizes, it's like, oh, I've been the Pharisee, unwilling. I've been the conspiracy theorist the whole time. I've been pushing the fake narrative. You know what I mean? And it's like that switch has to go off where it's like, oh, I'm the enemy. I'm the bad. I'm pushing the bad news. I'm the pseudoscientist.
Doug, with Genesis 6 there, obviously we're seeing what the strategy was there. What about with Psalm 82, right? Because you've got to cover your bases, right?
Yeah.
If you're going to shut down the supernatural element, Sons of God stuff with Genesis 6, you've got to address Psalm 82 as well. What do they do with that? Or is that just been glossed over? Because that in and of itself also is, you can't reconcile that with your rabbi's
Right.
new theory of Genesis 6?
Right. Great question. So, like I said, Jesus is having a confrontation with the Pharisees about this text, verse 6 especially. And so my understanding was this comes from a Jewish scholar named Alan Segal in a book called Two Powers in Heaven. So he never became a Christian, died just as a Jew. And he's the one that kind of broke this whole thing open about what in Psalm 82:1, the divine counsel, and some of the things that the Jews were doing with what he calls two powers in heaven. And in fact, the rabbis themselves called it two powers in heaven. So you had this undercurrent in Judaism that was willing to entertain the idea that, to put it in Christian terms, that there was one God in more than one person. And then you had probably, he thinks, and he's probably right, the majority of the rabbis were like, no, there's one God. It's very Unitarian in the way that it thinks about God. Okay. One person, one God. But there's an undercurrent, and Jesus is working into that. So I'm not sure what the rabbis themselves did with verse 1, but I can show you like the differences in just two translations here. So like the ESV says, God has taken his place in the divine council. In the midst of the gods, he holds judgment. Now compare that with a New American Standard. God takes his stand in his own congregation. He judges in the midst of the rulers. So the NAS has completely naturalized the first verse, which means that the rest of the psalm is naturalized. The ESV is doing the right work, and it's translating the divine counsel the way that it should be. We know that for a fact. There's huge papers that have been written on this, and he's doing this in the midst of the gods. Like the divine counsel it's a thing. It's all over the place, and people have read about it all over the place. God has a group of heavenly beings that help him administer the affairs of the cosmos. Isaiah 6, Daniel 7, 1 Kings 22 with the prophet Micaiah, and all these spirits arguing about who's going to go be a lying spirit in the mouth of the prophets, and it's everywhere. So you can hear what the NAS does. It's interesting. The NAS's text, they refuse to look at the Septuagint. It's only based on the Hebrew Masoretic text. I don't know that makes a difference there, but it's interesting.
Yeah, kind of like deleting that dimension out of it. They were just rulers.
Well, it's funny because also, Nate, like we haven't really even hardly talked about Psalm 82. I mean, it hasn't really. We've been heavy on Genesis 6. I think Heiser mentioned it offhanded.
Yeah, you want me to read it and kind of take us through it?
Yeah, if you want to read it, Doug, that'd be great.
Sure. There's a couple of points that I'd highlight in it. So I'll read from the ESV. Psalm of Asaph. God has taken his place in the divine council. In the midst of the gods, he holds judgment. How long will you judge unjustly and show partiality to the wicked? Selah. Give justice to the weak and the fatherless. Maintain the right of the afflicted and the destitute. Rescue the weak and the needy. Deliver them from the hand of the wicked. They have neither knowledge nor understanding. They walk about in darkness. All the foundations of the earth are shaken. I said, you are gods, sons of the Most High, all of you. Nevertheless, like men you shall die and fall like any prince. Arise, O God, judge the earth, for you shall inherit the nations. So let me take us through it. I'll try and do it as quick as I can. First verse, God is approaching the divine council, which is a group of heavenly beings, which is why it says he's in the midst of the gods, and he's going to judge them. So he's judging the gods. Very important. He then asks the question, how long will you judge unjustly? And people say, gods don't judge anything. Oh, yeah? How often do we read Yahweh saying, I care for the orphan and the widow. I take care of the needy. I dispense justice against the wicked. And if we understand that God there is the Son of God, okay, the Christ in the Old Testament, the angel of the Lord, if we understand that, now you've got a conceptual Christian ability to deal with the gods doing that too, as long as you can kind of get into the divine council worldview. But I mean, go read the Law Code of Hammurabi and read his introduction. And he says, hey, man, the gods gave me this. That's what he says. So it's all over the place. So he's basically saying in verses 2-4 that you guys have not done what I put you over the nations to do. And so now I'm going to judge you. Verse 5, I'll just highlight this one. All the foundations of the earth are shaken. Well, goodness, how could that be the case if it's just a bunch of like rabbinical guys in Israel? It doesn't make a lot of sense.
It's just a bunch of rulers, right? Just some, yeah.
Right? Verse 7, I'll look at verse 7 real quick before we look at verse 6. Nevertheless, you will die like men and fall like any prince. Okay, so first of all, what sense does it make to tell men that they're going to die like men? Of course they are. That's like a tautology. But if they're heavenly beings, then they can die. And people go, heavenly beings don't die. And I think, have you never read the end of Revelation where Satan is cast into the lake of fire? Well, what would you call that? It's called the second death, right? And then fall like any prince. And people will say, well, princes, that has to be humans. No, it doesn't. The word there in the Greek is an archon. And the archons all over the place in the New Testament are angelic beings. They are like in the book of Daniel as well. So that's just classic language for a prince is a son of a king, right? So they're the sons of God. So that then go back to verse 6. I said, you are God's sons of the Most High. So you see how sons of the Most High is paralleling prince there. Sons of the Most High. Well, those are our guys from Genesis 6 right there. And who is he saying are gods? You are gods, sons of the Most High, all of you. The people from verse 1. In the midst of the gods, he holds judgment. These are the guys God set over the nations. And it was really kind of punishment, like Heiser says, it was kind of mutual punishment for the sin of Tower of Babel. But when Jesus uses this verse to confront the Pharisees, he's not saying that the Pharisees are gods. Nowhere in the entire Old Testament is Elohim ever mean a human being. Ever. This would be the only place, and it's used like 2,000 times. So let's be consistent with the way that we deal with it. He is claiming, this is the claim, and that Heiser has a really good paper on this, that he actually, believe it or not, he did this in a Mormon periodical. They invited him to come and do it. And then they had a guy that would respond to him, and then he got the last word and got to write a response. So it's like 3 papers in a row on this. So you can go look that up online. Really good read. It's a long read, but it's good. Jesus is claiming to be one of the sons of God. That's what he's doing. I'm one of the sons of God, not you guys. And then verse 8 is the key. It's the linchpin of the whole thing. Arise, O God, and judge the earth, for you shall inherit all the nations. So now wait a minute. Inheriting. Who inherits things? Fathers or sons? Sons inherit. Who's the God of verse 8? It's the Son of God, the one from verse 6 that Jesus is claiming to be the Pharisees. He's going to inherit the nations. And what's so interesting is if you go back to Psalm 2, it's the exact same thing. People know this very well, I think. As for me, I set my king on Zion, on my holy hill. I will tell of the decree. The Lord said to me, you are my son. Today I have begotten you. Ask of me, and I will make the nations your inheritance and the ends of the earth your possession. So Psalm 2:8 parallels Psalm 82:8, except for that Psalm 82:8 is like taking it a step further. Psalm 2:8 is the father telling the son, ask of me, and I'll give you whatever you want. I'll make even the nations your inheritance. And Psalm 82:8 is, you will inherit the nations.
Okay, so in layman's terms, is this why we kind of see around the world these abandoned kingdoms where people say, oh yeah, there's these advanced civilizations and all over the world? Were they ruled by these gods, and did they just overnight lose their power when Jesus inherits them?
Well, it's a great question. And I have problems in 2 areas of the question, knowing how to answer it. So like you guys had contacted me and said, hey, let's do a show on Atlantis, right?
Right.
Yeah.
So the problem is, like, my understanding of Atlantis, if it's a real place, would be that it would be pre-flood. But the giving of the gods to the nations is a post-flood thing that happens at Babel. So I don't know how to answer that. And yet, like, if you go and read Plato on this, on Atlantis, in the same place he's talking about it, he's talking about how Greece, he actually, it's like Plato has read Deuteronomy 32, 7 and 8. I'm not kidding. He uses the exact same language. He's like, when God gave to the nations their inheritance, he literally says this exact same thing. And he goes, God gave to Greece Athena and Hephaestus to be the gods over Greece. And then he explains why, like, they're the gods of wisdom and beauty and philosophy. And so he's playing that up. And then he goes, and Poseidon was the god of Atlantis, which is really interesting, right? Like, what in the world?
Do you think all these gods were bad? Were they all evil?
That's another great question. Like, so if you read Psalm 82, it makes you think that when the original allotment happened, that God had in mind that they would rule in his stead like a vassal king or something like that, and that he expected them to rule well. And so, like, I think they're probably all fallen, but I don't think they're all equally evil. It's just like humans. We're all sinful, but we're not all equally as bad as that we could be, and those kinds of things. So, and I think actually Plato's kind of making that argument, like the gods that were over Greece, like these guys did a good job with us. Now he talks about different ages. He talks about golden age before the flood. He talks about silver age after that kind of stuff.
Interesting.
So it's hard for me to answer that question on that end. And then, I forget what the second part of that was, but
it's just in layman's terms, I'm just thinking assistant to the regional manager, right? They're all
right. I mean, God doesn't just, he's sovereign over all things, but he allows for image bearers, which I think angels are included in that, to have dominion and to carry that out, because they're beings that have their own minds and wills and whatever. So
Heiser said what they're doing is they fear their own destruction, and you were kind of talking about that a minute ago, where they will have their death in the end. These sons of God, it sounds like they're going to meet their end. The ones that I guess it's just like after. It seems like something happens with Christ's death,
right?
And then we enter this age of where humans are flourishing.
The New Testament, right? The New Testament. I mean, essentially, like once the death of Christ, and we're talking about when he goes and we break all these things, right? It's the undoing, as we talked about in a few episodes before. And Christ goes back and undoes all these things.
Yeah, that reminds me. So that's the second part of what I've said is hard to answer. Have you guys ever had Brian Godawa on your show?
We did like our second episode, and we just weren't ready for him.
Oh, okay. Interesting.
And then the internet cut out. It was just like, I think we were going to revisit it later. We'll have him on later, but go ahead.
So I have this debate with him over this question, like what happened to the gods at the death of Christ? And then it goes to 70 AD too. So he's a preterist in his view of eschatology, a partial preterist. And he thinks that they were completely undone and that they're no longer ruling the nations. And he accounts for supernatural evil purely with the demons, like Enoch saying a tenth of them are still running around here, that kind of stuff. That's very minority view. Like I don't think Heiser takes that view. I don't take that view, but I do think that Jesus did something very significant to them, which is that he took away their authority to rule over the people if God decides that he wants to release, the elect from their grasp and save them. So, if the gospel comes to Greece or if it comes to Asia Minor or whatever, and those people are under the authority of some supernatural being, in the Old Testament, they would have, the gospel wouldn't have the legal right to free someone from their sin, because the gods are over that territory. That's the whole point of like Naaman. Remember Naaman, where he's the leper, and he goes to Elisha, and Elisha says, "Yeah, I'll heal you, but you have to come to the Jordan River to do it." And he's like, "Why would I want to go to that stinking, filthy river when the Euphrates is right here and it's pristine and beautiful?" He goes, "Because you have to come down here where Yahweh is." So, that's the turf territory stuff. Well, Jesus is inheriting the nations right now. Like he legally owns all the nations, but I don't think that he has dispossessed the gods themselves yet until the second coming. So there's like, it's like an already not yet kind of a thing going on. That's the way I think about it.
I mean, and like, you could put it in Lord of the Rings terms, say, because people know that story better for some reason. But like there was an age where it's like the ring's been cut off, but it's still lingering. The you know what I mean? Like Sauron's he's not in control like he was, but there's still this lingering evil.
That. Yeah.
Right? Like that's kind of how it feels. And so we're in this age of man, and we doubt. Now we're in this point where the church is completely divorcing itself from the Old Testament. At least a big part of it is. That didn't happen. That didn't exist. They didn't understand what we understand clearly now. But it seems like it's like people who doubt the existence of giants. If your grandfather saw giants, the chances are you believe it. But a couple generations go by, nobody, one of your family members hadn't ever seen a giant, so you just, they didn't ever exist.
Yeah.
Right? It's like the closer you were to somebody that you knew and loved experiencing this, the more you have a chance to believe it. So what do we have now? We just have to, I don't know, like be extremely humble before we can believe some of this stuff. I don't know what has to happen. That's always the thing that goes on in my mind is like, what turned the lights on for me? Everyone has a different story.
Yeah, everyone has a different turning point, It's going to be something different for everybody.
But hearing you say this, I can't go back. Like, it's almost too much information. I think a lot of people listening to this are like, man, that's the idea of Jesus is just multiplied tenfold.
Right. Oh yeah. Yeah, it's like my view of the Bible. This stuff didn't undo anything, I believe, but it like multiplied my understanding like the stars of the sky. I mean, and really it's a 3D sort of a thing, 4D. I mean, you're going into space. That literally is what you're doing. And it's so huge, and it can be overwhelming. At the same time, there's still a very simple storyline to this, which centers on who Jesus is and his person, and the fact that God is dispossessing these guys of their inheritance, these fallen sons of God, and he's giving it to the only begotten Son. And in the most simplest terms, that's what this is about. And the conspiracy theory of the Jews that we were talking about really is trying to undo that. It's a very demonic sort of a thing. And Jesus says that they're sons of their father, the devil, for a reason. So I think that it's very supernatural in origin, the conspiracy theories that they use to attack our Savior.
Dude, yeah.
Crazy. And we have these clues. Even Plato's talking about Poseidon and these. Do you think these were sons of God, or do you think they were Nephilim? Were they?
No, they're sons of God, absolutely. 100%. Yeah, these are the Olympians.
Does that make Zeus then Satan? Is that one and the same?
My belief is that Zeus is Satan. I believe that Baal is Satan. I think they're the same. I think they're all the same person. I have reasons for that, but
it's all interchangeable. And
probably Thor is probably the same one. They're all kind of like the god of thunder, except for Satan. But there are connections, like in the Revelation 2 or 3, I forget which one it is. One of the churches, Church of Pergamum, I think. Your throne is where Satan is, or Satan's throne is there. The thing is that throne it was taken to the British Museum, and it was actually an altar to Zeus. So, I think that you have kind of clues that Zeus and Satan are the same person. Certainly, I think very, very solid to say that Baal and Zeus are the same person in the pantheons.
It's wild, man.
And they're the sons of God. They're not Nephilim.
Starts to make everything make a lot of sense, right? Nephilim were the Titans then, and you had these.
No. The Titans are also sons of. I would say that if you want to think about it in Greek terms, the Titans would be the pre-flood sons of God that were locked up. The Olympians are the post-flood gods that are given to the nations, and then the demigods like Hercules and Achilles and all those guys, who have a heavenly father like Zeus and then a human mother. Those
Interesting
are
how that thread across cultures, across time. It's not this isn't just a Genesis 6 thing, right? This is mythology, right?
It's everywhere.
And then you get into the blurry creature space, which brings things full circle, where you have also the genetic experiments with animals.
Right. Yeah. So I'm preaching on Revelation, and I'm in chapter 10 this week, and I've just been thinking about this. It talks about how John heard 7 thunders. It actually says the 7 thunders, and then he was told, "Don't write them down." And a lot of people have their reasons what they think don't write them down means. And I think that what's going on is that the seven thunders were actually known to everybody. Everybody knew what the seven thunders were. He didn't need to write them down. It's just that it wasn't the point in the book to do it yet. So what are the seven thunders? Well, you go back to Psalm 29, which is a completely supernatural psalm that begins saying, well, hey, sons of God, you better worship God right now, because he thunders and he's coming in a storm. And so it gives seven thunders in that verse. And it starts up in northern Syria. It goes down over Mount Hermon, which is interesting. And then it goes down into Kadesh, which is a Canaanite place that worshiped Baal. So what's so interesting about the seven thunders is that Baal was the god of seven thunders. I mean, he's the thunder god, for crying out loud. It's what he is. And so the whole thing is like, in some ways, it's a ripoff of Canaanite mythology. But why? Why would he be doing that? Well, it's because there's a war going on in the Old Testament between Baal and Yahweh. And people don't understand, again, just to kind of repeat this whole thing. What do I mean, Yahweh? I'm not talking about the Father. I'm talking about the Son of God. It's which son is really the true one to inherit. Is it Baal? Is it Molech? Or is it the angel of the Lord? Is it Christ? Who's it going to be? And then the New Testament comes along and tells us, here's who it is, and here's how it happened. Here's why it happened.
Then how do we tie that up with the Trinity, right? Because if Jesus is one of the sons of gods, but is also God.
So he's the in Psalm 2. Today I have begotten you. He's the Son of God. He's the only
like
begotten.
Capital S
Father.
Son.
Right. So all the others are created, and in fact, you go back to Genesis 1. And the Son of God is the one who created these guys in the first place.
So does this go, like we talked to Timothy Alberino on here, and actually this makes me think of this. He talks about how he refers to the angels as the elder race, that there was this, that the Trinity God, Son, existed before.
The prodigal
son
story.
Right, the idea that like they created the angels, and they were created also in the image of God, like sons of God, but they're not the capital S Son of God. Maybe they look like, he contends they look like us. That God created this. He created the angelic beings. They didn't exist before everything like God did. I don't know if we're getting this crazy space here. My mind's starting to like fry out. But
it's almost like God. It's almost like God and Jesus are in the major leagues and everyone else is in the minors.
Yeah, that's right.
But these minor leaguers were the creations of Yahweh, and then capital S.
I
Son.
look at it a lot like, I like to take the incarnation as an analogy for what we're talking about with the angels. So, Jesus is born. He's worshipped by the Magi who come from the east. There's a few people who know who he is. Simeon and Anna, they know who he is as an infant. But you go to Isaiah 53, and it's like there's nothing about his appearance that should draw him to us. And so most people have no idea who he is. They're sitting there looking at God in the flesh, and they completely miss him unless he reveals himself to them. All right, so my thought is, if he is the angel of the Lord, and I think that he is, why should it be any different in the angelic realm than it would be here? Like, why should he be infinitely more superior in their eyes? Why not be one of them in the way that they think of him? That would completely mess with their minds, and that would explain why Baal thinks that he can usurp Yahweh. Because he thinks that Yahweh is just like Yam, like the sea god who he defeated in his Baal cycle war. But the reality is that he's kidding himself, or he doesn't know, or whatever the case is. And so God's word comes along and teaches us that no, Yahweh's son, second power Yahweh, whatever you want to call him, little Yahweh, he actually is God. He's very God of very God, like our creeds say. And the whole Bible is really the story of teaching us how that is, and how he's the one who's disinheriting these other guys who are just pretenders to the throne.
Do we have any idea how many sons of God there are?
No, I don't think so. We know that there's a number 70 that's associated with them. And 70 is it's 7 and 10, right? And those are both in kind of numerology. Those are numbers of perfection and that kind of thing. So I think that there's not an infinite number of them. like it talks about the heavenly host and myriads, that those are going beyond the sons of God to other creatures, you know. The sons of God are a limited group, I think.
Yeah.
You know, I don't think that there's 100 million of them or anything like that.
Yeah. And is there any redemption for any of them?
So the best that I can come up with is Paul talking about the elect angels. The weird verse in Corinthians talks about the elect angels. It's really strange. Like,
is that a homage to Enoch as well? Because Enoch talks a ton about the elect, and there's the elect this and the elect that.
It could be. I haven't thought about that directly, but the whole idea of being elect, I don't know why you need to be elect unless you had somehow like fallen, and you needed some kind of redemption. So, you know, I wonder about guys like if we were Catholics or something, and we were talking about Raphael and Gabriel and all, you know, the archangels that they have. I tend to think that those guys are sons of God, too, but they're loyal to Yahweh. So there's, you know, if they were redeemed somehow or saved or elect or whatever the case would be, I don't have a problem with that. But I would have a problem like Baal. He's irredeemable.
Yeah. So how do Doug? I have a question on that. Doug, I got a question on this. And this has always blown my mind a bit. These sons of God are obviously in the kingdom of God. They were with the Almighty God. I have always like banged my head on the wall, understanding how you could be in the presence of God and yet still rebel or still believe you could overthrow or that you'd put yourself on an equal plane.
So here's an analogy. The first thing popped in my head is a tabernacle in Israel in Leviticus. So this is a separate space, and it's holy space, and it's very obvious. I mean, it's made very specific. You know, you got to have the gold here and the silver here, the bronze here. It has to look exactly a specific way. Like everything about what we're told about the tabernacle in the second half of Exodus all the way through Leviticus is that this is holy space. And not only that, but God's presence is actually really inside that veil on the Ark of the Covenant. Okay, so then you come to Leviticus 10, and you got the two sons of Aaron who in the verse right before it, I'll read this to you guys. I'll pull it up here quick. So the last verse of Leviticus 9, fire came out from before the Lord and consumed the burnt offering and the pieces of fat on the altar. And when the people saw it, they shouted and fell on their faces. The very next verse, so this is heavenly fire. Like this is exactly what you're talking about, Luke. Like everybody sees it, right? The very next verse, the two oldest sons of Aaron who have just gone through this long ordination ceremony to become priests and work in this very space. It says, the sons of Aaron each took his censer and put fire in it and laid incense on it and offered unauthorized fire before the Lord, which he had not commanded. And fire came out from before the Lord and consumed them, and they died before the Lord. The whole point of the story is that basically, to put it in the terms you just said, these guys were in the very presence of God and they didn't see it. And they didn't see it. And they didn't see it. So you have to be given eyes by God himself to see what you're talking about.
There's just this element of humility that keeps coming to my mind. You have to be humbled in some way, shape, or form. That God requires it. You must be humble. Whether that's you go through some sort of wilderness. I mean, you know, Jesus goes out in the wilderness and there's a moment of vulnerability, right? I think a lot of people maybe they just haven't gotten to the end of their rope to where they can, because I think Heiser brought up that, Luke, where he says, you know, God lets you play the chess game, but he's going to win. He doesn't make your moves for you, right?
Right.
So there's this element of it's playing out. God gave us that free will, but at the same time, ultimately, we're not going to win the game. But I think everyone gets that moment where they think, I could win. I might be able to beat him. Is that what's happening in the garden? Is that what's happening with Satan? Does he really think he's going to win this game?
Yeah, I think he really does. So something I've been wanting to say really the whole time, and I just
say it.
We keep going into other things, is that talking about conspiracy theories, let's go back to that for just a second. In order to believe in conspiracy theories, this is my opinion, and I think I put it in near the end of the book, you really have to believe that people are not basically good. They're basically evil. They're basically sinful. That sin really is just pervasive in this world and in people's hearts and in my heart. And if you don't believe that, then you can't entertain conspiracy theories because, hey, I should just trust everybody that says anything to me, and because they're basically good and they mean me well. If though you can understand sin, and this is like a Romans 3 sort of thing, where Paul's just leveling everybody, Jew and Gentile, from head to toe. Our mouths are serpents, and our feet run as fast as they can to shed blood. We are sinful creatures. I mean, that's what we are. And if we can't come to grips with that personally, let alone in the world around us, then you can never come to humility that you were just talking about. You can't do it because you don't need to. Why would you need to be humble if you're basically a good person? And that's exactly how self-deception works.
And I mean, out of that, comes every deception, right? Out of that comes every deception. It's the works gospel that we're basically good enough as long as we do enough good stuff. Then I think you reach the point of it's where a lot of the rest of the world lives, like where I don't need a savior, right? I don't need a savior because I'm basically good.
If you think about it from those terms, then really the gospel that we proclaim about Christ, that is the conspiracy theory. Think about what the rabbis did, the Jews did when Jesus died, and they said they stole his body. You brought that up at the very beginning, I think, Nate.
Yeah.
That's the great conspiracy theory. But here's the problem with that. Because they were the authorities, that wasn't the conspiracy theory. The conspiracy theory was that Jesus rose from the dead.
Right. That was
the disciples, the apostles were the ones spewing off conspiracy theories.
And the narrative was,
yeah, that's right. They controlled the narrative, and so they get to tell what the conspiracy theory is and what isn't. So my point in saying that is a conspiracy theory can be true. And the conspiracy theory in this case would be the gospel that Jesus actually rose from the dead. It's true because something else was going on, which was that there was a conspiracy to lie about what happened and to create a totally different narrative.
Mm-hmm.
So, I mean, the reality is that, it was the Jews who created the conspiracy theory, but in the moment, it was the disciples who actually had the conspiracy theory because they didn't have any power.
Yeah.
See what I'm saying? Does that make sense in terms of how we're to look at conspiracy theories? Like, who's telling us that the conspiracy theorists are listening to Q? Well, the people in power are telling us that.
And
right.
Yep.
You know, whether Q's true or not, whatever you want to think about that, Q isn't in power, so it can't tell you that it's true or not true. All you can do is go look at it yourself.
Well, I've used that argument against a couple of friends who've pushed back and said, I believe in every conspiracy theory. I said, are you a Christian? Yes. Then you believe in one.
Yeah.
Right? Like you believe in one. You believe that the disciples were telling the truth of the establishment, right? And it goes but they can't see it that way because it's been accepted. It's been socially accepted that Christ rose again.
Right.
So therefore I can believe in this. So here, let's apply this to the beginning of the conversation. Maybe we can kind of end somewhere in here. People believe that the Smithsonian, if they find giant bones, they're good people. They're going to do the right thing and report it. And what we're saying is no. They're going to go along with whoever's in charge and continue the narrative that these things didn't exist, right? So when you have these conversations like, oh man, if they found bones, they'd report them. They're scientists. They're about discovery. They want to push discovery.
Right. Just look at 2020 to find out how well that's worked.
Right.
Yeah. But they inherently believe people are going to do the right thing.
That's exactly right.
It's funny how it is though. Yeah.
And we're saying no, they won't.
Yeah. It's not. I mean, it's not a proof that the Smithsonian dad's done anything, but it's something that you need to be there in order for it to be true. If that makes sense.
Yeah.
I think people, for whatever reason, really want to believe that the people in power and the people that have the megaphone and these people actually have everyone else's best interests in as their goal. And when you come from a point of everybody's sinful and really everybody's out for themselves for the most part, it's not a big downer on but most people, I would say, even in the church, if they're out for themselves, then it's it's really hard to trust that loud message or that official message or that whatever you're hearing from the powers that be is actually the truth and not some spin on a narrative that benefits them and not you.
You know, so this reminds me of something that I think is important to bring up kind of on the other side of this, that like the way that we've talked about how this conversation goes to the end here, like we've kind of opened up maybe for some people that, okay, maybe I can entertain a conspiracy theory, but what, maybe I shouldn't be trusting anybody, you know, and now you can enter into like this crazy space in your head that starts creating worry and anxiety and fear and obsession over conspiracy theories and mistrust of everybody. I think about like Alex Jones. I mean, it's kind of the epitome of that kind of thing. Anger,
right?
Frustration. These are the exact opposite things of the fruit of the Spirit. And so I think what I would want to say is that I think that it's important for people. Not everybody has to entertain conspiracy theories or whatever, but if they don't entertain them, they need to understand that there's possible consequences for that if they don't entertain it. 2020 is a perfect example. Look at our kids wearing masks in school, and nobody that age ever dies of coronavirus ever. But that doesn't stop people. They don't care. There's consequences for not entertaining conspiracy theories. But if you go down that road, like maybe for the first time or something, you need to beware. And the solution to the, you know, some of the negative things, that the trappings of conspiracy theories, is that you have to go back to the source and to Christ and to his Spirit and the fruit that he brings into our life of patience and peace and kindness and gentleness and those kinds of things.
This is testing the spirits, Doug, right? I mean, this is what we're supposed to test the spirits.
Absolutely.
I think there's always someone selling T-shirts on both sides, right?
Absolutely.
So
only a band guy.
Yeah.
You gonna wear your own T-shirt though? For
definitely a band guy here. But one of the last thoughts I had is this is why I think people trust Joe Rogan so much. It's like I'm not going to trust the Nike podcast or the Apple podcast, but I might be able to trust Joe Rogan because he's just one dude. You know what I mean? And so there's this massive, just like, what does Joe Rogan think about this? Because he's just one guy, and he might be harder to crack that just one person. It might be harder for the whole system to get to that one guy than it would be a giant NPR podcast who's gone through.
Well, this is pre-Spotify, Joe, because now
I
he's
was
on $100
just
million
thinking that
hook,
same
so-
thing. Like, has the $100 million done anything to him?
But he talked out against the vaccine last week and got a bunch of crap for it.
Yeah, he did.
So
maybe not. Yeah.
People are hungry for something that hasn't been uncorrupted, or something that hasn't been corrupted. You know what I mean? Like I don't know.
But that's exactly what I'm saying, is that there is no such thing as something uncorrupted, and people are kidding themselves if they think there is.
Sure.
And so you've got to have that in your mind, and that the corruption starts with me. It's not just a big corporation like Facebook or Zuckerberg. It's not that Joe Rogan could be corrupt, but maybe he didn't start out that way. No, he's corrupt, and so am I. And the only solution to this, on both sides of this high-wired tightrope sort of a thing, is Christ. I mean, I'm telling you, I'm absolutely convinced of that, because he allows me to be able to have the freedom to think about things that other people say are dangerous or whatever. But at the same time, he gives me the ability not to be consumed by them.
But that gets a little bit hairy too, because the Pharisees were convinced they had the truth. They had that ability. I don't know. A lot of people think they have Christ, and you wonder. Do they? Do we?
It's true. Well, I think we should all probably be asking that question of ourselves.
Sure. Man, this is a great episode. Thank you so much. Like, we're out to figure out what Bigfoot is. But I mean, you brought up a lot of great points of like the Olympians and the Titans and prehistory. Man, the more we get into this show, Doug, I bet you if you could walk around for a day in the pre-Diluvian society, it must have just been, I think it would blow all our minds what was going on.
Oh, I think so too. Yeah.
Off topic a bit too, but I would love to also, now after this conversation, especially get into Atlantis. So maybe we'll have to do that at some point as well. Because just the idea too, when we started diving into this doesn't even be on the podcast, Nate, if we don't have to put it in there, but just the idea of when we're diving into the Poseidon was this, had this, and then it was about Baal and Zeus, and I think all that stuff is super interesting when we consider the historical account of that place, and then also the Sons of God stuff. I mean, so anyway, Doug, I know you're a busy man, but at some point,
fun,
it'd be fun
for sure.
No, I really appreciate your time coming on. And
sorry, I was late. I'm glad that you guys caught me on Facebook. So,
oh man,
no, it's good. We appreciate you coming on. I know I know the Zoom call in 2020 is a little bit tiring, so we appreciate the coming on, dropping all this stuff on us because we're a creatures podcast, and ultimately we're trying to figure out the giants and how does that relate to the weird creatures that people still see today. And we're going all the way back, so that's kind of our mission.
But I think that you guys, I think it's important what the idea that you wanted to talk about conspiracy theories today, because you cannot get around it with the topic that you guys are doing. You just can't.
No, can't. And half our guests are afraid of them. You can just sense it.
Yeah, yeah.
They're afraid to. They're academics. They're in that league, and they don't want to get shunned or kicked out.
Right.
And we're a podcast, so we don't care. We're just like, we're going to say whatever we want. We're
we're not. You follow the money, there isn't any.
Exactly. We're not. But we're trying. So you want to let anyone listening, if they want to get involved with what you're doing, Doug, tell them how they can get involved with you and link, talk about where they can buy your book, and let's give you some money.
Yeah, get some plug here, Doug. Plug for Doug.
Yeah, so my website changed, unfortunately. I let it slide, and within a week, some company gobbled up my name. It made me so mad. So it's changed to douglasvandorn.com. And
that's very
it still looks the same as it did before. And I got all the books and stuff there. You can go to get the books. I've done a book on giants and conspiracy theories, and just came out with one last summer on the angel of the Lord. Bunch of other books up there too, and they're all at Amazon. You can get them in paperback. You can get them in Kindle. And I don't think they're going to take me off, but that's its own conspiracy theory. We'll see. And we also have a church website. The church that I pastor is Reformed Baptist Church in Northern Colorado, and the reason I would plug that is just because we have most of my sermons up there, and many of them are in PDF form. So like, if you wanted to look into Psalm 82 or Psalm 29 or Psalm 2 that we looked at today, you go and read the whole sermon, and I got lots of footnotes in there and pictures and all kinds of stuff. So, and it's all totally free resources. So, done a bunch of books and a lot of stuff up there.
Awesome. Well, I really enjoyed our first episode, so it's great to have you back on the show. Thanks for coming.
I didn't do the very first episode with you guys, did I?
This guy Duke, who we had a couple of Bigfoot guys on first, and then went from there.
Well, Doug, thanks, man. Totally appreciate it.
Yeah, you bet.
Man,
thanks for having me on, guys.
Yeah, thank you.
Good to see you again.
Hey, you too. Let's do the Atlantis time thing anytime you want.
Absolutely. Awesome. 100%.
We'll hit you up.
Thanks, Doug.
See you guys.
Oh, dude. Well, I love it. I think Doug brought up some really good points. Man, makes you really realize who were the sons of God and who were the Nephilim. I think, and how it relates to conspiracy theories, a lot of good nuggets there. I think a lot of our listeners are probably scratching their heads a little bit going, man, this just pushed my expansion. We can't understand, but I think we can get little glimpses of it. And clearly it's more complicated than we've been taught.
Yeah.
And more in depth.
Yeah, I agree.
And some it scares people. They get worried about like, whoa, I'm gonna believe the wrong thing. Well, welcome to Blurry Creatures.
Yeah, that's why you got to test the spirits. That's why you got to do your research.
Yeah.
I mean, and that's why you got to ask questions.
Yeah.
All those things are part of the formula for discerning the truth, especially in a world that we live in, that we know there is a coordinated and massive push for deception by the enemy of our souls and our hearts. And so when you realize that you were born into a world of war, and that we live in a place where there's very real warfare for our hearts, minds, and our souls, I think that's, if you remind yourself that the context of that perspective, then I think it's imperative that we practice critical thinking, asking questions, testing the spirits, and really seeking out the truth. Because everything else out there is noise and smoke and mirrors, and it's meant to be that way.
Love it, Luke. Love to be on this journey with you. And everyone out there listening to this podcast, we love that you guys are here with us. And like Luke said in the last episode, we welcome all thoughts here. We're not trying to say, I mean, we're not just bringing on any old buddy on the podcast. We're casting some lines out there, but the people who come on are consistently telling a story. And we don't have control over who comes on the podcast necessarily, like who gets back to us and wants to come on the podcast. Obviously, we send out messages, but we're just trying to take one lead to the next lead. But we welcome dissent. We welcome disagreements. We don't know. We're not the experts. And so if you're coming to this podcast expecting like, oh man, these guys know everything, like clearly we don't. But
I can actually verify that we do not.
But we hope that, there's some authenticity there that you found in we've been through enough crap in life to have arrived at a place where, hey, I can say that. I don't know. It takes a long time to learn how to say that. Yeah.
And be comfortable with that, right? Like, especially in a world where everybody claims to have the answers. And again, that's what you got to sort it out.
Your guess is as good as mine on a lot of this. We're just asking questions, and we're happy to have you guys on the journey. If you want to hear more, blurrycreatures.com. Become a member. Support the show. Luke and I have put a lot of time into this show so far.
And the merch, your merch orders are coming out soon. You're gonna get your shirts soon. Yeah, become a member, join our team, and we're gonna continue just to push the envelope and ask questions and provide a platform. In some ways, a space. It's not safe here. A space though, where we can talk about all these things, or talk about conspiracy theories like I did with Doug Van Dorn.
Yeah, and shout out to Judd. We sent out the bat signal to Judd to find Doug, who forgot what day it was, and Judd got Doug on the show. So there you go.
Dr. Judd and his amazing beret, always coming through for us.
Till next time.
Stay blurry.